Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Evan. I'm a graduate assistant at the University Speaking Center, and today we're here to talk about managing public speaking anxiety. All right, so that's the title of your workshop. Hopefully you have a workshop packet in front of you. And we're going to talk about a whole host of things today as they relate to public speaking. Now, how many of you have been in a Speaking Center workshop before? Anyone? Some of you have, some of you haven't. Well, the way Speaking Center workshops typically go, we have some lecture elements, so we're going to talk about a little literature, what the literature has to say about public speaking anxiety. We're also going to do some interactive activities, so I'm not just up here talking the whole time, but these activities are going to be designed to illustrate some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about today. Okay. So let me start by asking you a question. How many of you have had any experience in public speaking before you came here to UNCG? So, did you learn anything about public speaking in high school? A couple of you yes, a couple of you no. Okay, well I know when I came to the university, for example, I didn't have any prior experience in public speaking in high school. And as hopefully you all know, we have what's called a communication across the curriculum program here at UNCG, which basically means that you're going to have to take at least 2 speaking intensive courses in the college before you graduate. Usually one inside your major, one outside of your major. So these competencies are going to be important. And oftentimes we don't have a lot of background because we didn't learn about this before we came to the university. So as a result, I think a lot of anxiety starts to build associated with public speaking. So we're going to talk about where this anxiety comes from, how it manifests itself in us as an individual, and how we can kind of start to manage that anxiety. So if you flip over to the first page in your packet, I want to briefly go over the objectives for today's workshop. So hopefully by the end of the workshop today, you'll be able to describe how anxiety occurs, as well as to identify the various types of anxiety. We also want to be able to chart our levels of anxiety throughout the whole process. So we need to learn not only how anxiety manifests itself in its different types, but also when we feel the most anxiety associated with giving a presentation. And then finally, we want to identify techniques to manage speaking anxiety and communication apprehension. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and that is the third objective for today's workshop. So we all on the same page? Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Well, before we begin, and usually at the beginning of any workshop that the Speaking Center conducts, we engage in what we call an icebreaker activity. So today's icebreaker activity is a self-assessment test, which is going to help us determine when we feel the most anxiety, in what kind of situation. So that as we move through today's workshop, you'll know a little bit about your own personal anxiety and how it manifests itself in you as an individual, so that we can begin to address that anxiety with some of the various strategies that we'll be talking about later. So you should see on your desk a self-assessment test. Okay? This is about 24 questions. It's going to ask you to determine, does this situation cause a lot of anxiety? Does it cause no anxiety? Or is it somewhere in the middle? So some of these questions or some of these responses are going to be fairly similar to other ones. The idea here is to answer these questions as quickly as possible. So kind of go with your first impression. And then once you finish that, there's a scoring sheet on the back which is going to help you to determine in what situation do you feel the most speaking anxiety. So take a moment and fill out that sheet. You can score it with instructions on the back of the sheet, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit about what those findings were. All right. So hopefully you've had a chance now to kind of fill out that anxiety assessment test, and you've been able to score your answers. I want to ask you first of all, did you find this activity difficult? Was it easy? Did you feel that you have an accurate representation of how you feel the most anxiety? So I guess maybe my first question should be, when do you feel the most anxiety, Alyssa?
Mine was more in the dyadic or pairs section, so I guess more like one-on-one and in interviews.
Absolutely, yeah. So dyadic would definitely be kind of one-on-one communication with another individual. Sure. How about you, Crystal?
Okay, I say group. The reason why I say group is because when you're in with a lot of people, sometimes you feel obligated to speak.
Mm-hmm. So do you feel that that's an accurate representation? Do you feel like of the 4 that you feel the most anxiety when you're speaking in groups?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. All right, and just to let you know, for me, the most anxiety I felt was involved in public speaking, right? So this is more formal presentation in front of a group of people. Now I think what's important to note here, though, is that while you scored highly in group, Crystal, and while you scored highly in dyadic pairs, Alyssa, oftentimes we experience anxiety not just in one type of communication situation. So hopefully you'll notice you didn't score 0 on any of the others. So you experience some anxiety perhaps when it's related to public speaking, some anxiety as it relates perhaps to speaking in a meeting or in pairs or in a group. So what's important to note here is that oftentimes we experience anxiety kind of associated with many different types of communication situations. Some situations cause us more anxiety than others. Does that make sense? So now that we know a little bit about when we experience the most anxiety and what kind of situation, how do you think maybe we could apply this information to reducing our anxiety when we do have to speak in those situations?
Ways to manage it, maybe?
Absolutely, and that's something we're definitely going to be talking about today. Ways to manage anxiety as it relates to the specific type of anxiety that you feel. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on then to our first objective. So if you flip over in your packet to the next page, what we want to do is kind of start with the basics, all right? We need to understand what speaking anxiety is and how it starts to happen, as well as the different kind of types of speaking anxiety. So if you're following along in your packet, the first definition that we need to define in order to understand this is what we call physical arousal. So physical arousal is going to be the first blank in your packet. Okay? Now physical arousal relates to changes in an individual that occur physically. All right? These can include things like an increased pulse, greater alertness, increased levels of energy. Right? It's things that we feel physically when we're confronted with a specific speaking situation, whether it's in groups, whether it's in front of a large audience, what have you. Okay? Now, speech anxiety, which is going to be your next definition, are unpleasant thoughts and feelings that are aroused by anticipated communication or an actual situation where we are going to have to speak. So this could be in a class, maybe for our church, whatever kind of speaking situation you're going to be in. Right? Anxiety is derived from those situations through thoughts and feelings. Now what's important to note here, and you can see this on your chart, and I'll explain this chart here in a minute. Let me go ahead and put it up on the board so that we can all see it. So what's going to be important to note here is that physical arousal can transform into speech anxiety if we allow it to. Okay? So what we notice here, we have this kind of bell curve. All right? On our y-axis, we have our level of performance. Okay? So this relates to how effectively we are able to deliver a presentation in public, how well we're able to participate in a meeting, things of that nature. Okay, so low, medium, and high. And obviously high is what we want to strive for, a high level of performance. Now down here on the x-axis, we have the level of arousal. Okay, so these are those kind of physical manifestations that we feel as an individual. So what you'll notice is that the optimal performance level corresponds to a high level of performance and a medium level of arousal. Okay? So when we start to have a high level of arousal, when we start to feel a lot of physical symptoms associated with speaking, this is where it turns into speaking anxiety. All right? When we let those physical symptoms manifest themselves to us in a great extent, and as you can see, the more or the higher level of arousal we have, the lower our performance goes. Okay? But so too, if we have no arousal at all or fairly low level, all right, we're also not performing at an optimum level. So this means that when we experience a lot of anxiety, or when we feel like we have no anxiety at all, both can be detrimental to our overall performance. Right? And that may seem a little bit counterintuitive. You know, if you have no anxiety, shouldn't that be a good thing? Well, oftentimes when people have no anxiety, they feel no motivation to do well. Oftentimes anxiety helps motivate us to give a really great presentation, or to prepare or organize our presentation very well, or to practice it multiple times to reduce that anxiety. So what we want to strive for here is a level of arousal, level of anxiety that is manageable. That is somewhere in between out of control and none. All right? So what we're striving for here is at the peak of this bell curve, this is our optimal performance level. Okay? Does anyone have any questions about this graph and what we mean by physical arousal, what we mean by optimum performance? Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so now that we understand a little bit about how anxiety happens, all right, and the fact that we want to experience some degree of anxiety, some degree of arousal, right, so that we can achieve that optimum performance. So then, how do we present our anxiety from going all the way over on that x-axis to the high level? All right, well, that's the next definition in your packet, and that is coping skills. So coping skills are mental and physical techniques that are going to allow us to control or to manage our anxiety so that we can prevent it from going all the way up to high, and we can strive for that medium level. Right? So those are some of the key definitions that we're going to be talking about. This is how anxiety happens when we allow that physical arousal to get out of control. So now I want to talk about anxiety specifically, okay? And there are two general types of anxiety if we're breaking it down. And the first one is what we call situational or state anxiety, All right? Now, situational anxiety, rather, is caused by factors in a specific communication situation. All right? So specific communication situation is the next blank in your packet. So, for example, a type of situational or state anxiety would perhaps be the forum that you're presenting in. Right? So maybe you're not presenting in front of your class, maybe you are presenting on a stage in front of an audience of thousands of people. Okay? So that's anxiety that's derived from the specific situation that you're speaking in. This is what we mean by state anxiety. Does anyone have an example of state anxiety or a time where they've experienced state anxiety before?
Presenting at a conference in front of professors.
Absolutely. Okay, so so it's your audience that's causing you some stress, some situational anxiety, right? Because you're presenting for professionals. It's a fantastic example. Now, the other type of anxiety that we experience is what we call trait anxiety. Now, trait anxiety is the next blank in your package. Okay? Now, trait anxiety is internal anxiety, and it's kind of anxiety that we bring to a speaking situation that's not directly relevant to that situation. Right? So, one way to think of this is kind of the anxiety baggage that we bring to a particular speaking situation, right? So, perhaps one time in the past, when we were presenting, maybe we were up here and we dropped all our note cards that we had prepared. And it took us 3 or 4 minutes to get those note cards arranged in order again. And you feel the anxiety level building as you're still fumbling around on the floor for those, right? So trait anxiety is those feelings of anxiety that you experienced one time that you are then projecting onto this future speaking situation. So thinking to yourself, oh man, what happens if I drop my Speaking Center note cards again, right? It's going to be a big deal. So these are two types of anxiety. It's important to know what type of anxiety you're feeling, whether it's situational and whether it's trait. And typically, just like the type of speaking anxiety situations that you feel, like we did in our icebreaker activity, oftentimes we experience a little bit of both. Okay? So our anxiety is often comprised of both situational and trait. But it's important to know what kind of anxiety you're experiencing most so that you can begin to target that specific type of anxiety. Does anyone have any questions about anxiety or about the chart that we showed, about the different types of anxiety? Are we all on the same page? Okay, fantastic. So we're going to go ahead now and move to another activity, all right? And this is an activity that's designed to now chart our levels of speaking anxiety. So with the icebreaker activity, we've determined, what situations cause us the most anxiety. Now what we want to do is to focus on that specific situation and kind of create a timeline so that we can see when, in the course of preparing for and then delivering a presentation, does our anxiety peak or do we feel the most anxiety. So if you're looking at your chart right here, what we're going to be doing is constructing a line graph. So on our x-axis here, we have different time periods before, during, and after a speech. So we have 1 week before, a day before, an hour before, a minute after. So what I want you to do is reflect maybe on a situation where you've had to deliver a speech in public in the past, or just kind of generally how you feel when you're preparing for a presentation. What we want to do is determine how high your anxiety is at that specific moment. So 1 week before, do you have no anxiety? Do you have a totally unmanageable level of anxiety? Or are you somewhere in the middle? So what I'd like you to do is take a moment and for each of these times kind of determine what level of anxiety you have. And then we'll kind of discuss our findings. All right? So if you take a minute to do that.